Let's pay our bills. Let's avert an economic shutdown. Let's drop the gimmicks, put aside what's good for any particular party, and let's focus on what's good for the American people, because they know we've got a lot of work to do. All right? So with that, let me take a couple of questions, and I will start with Julie Pace of AP.
Thank you, Mr. President. Obviously, if Congress does pass a clean CR and a clean debt ceiling bill, those may just be short-term measures. If that happens, does your offer to negotiate with them on issues like health care and spending and deficit reduction still stand in the intervening weeks if they pass measures that are just perhaps 6 weeks or 2 months long?
Absolutely. I mean, what I've said is that I will talk about anything. What'll happen is we won't agree on everything. I mean, the truth is that the parties are pretty divided on a whole bunch of big issues right now. Everybody understands that. And by the way, voters are divided on a lot of those issues too. And I recognize that there are some House members, Republican House members, where I got clobbered in the last election. And you know, they don't get politically rewarded a lot for being seen as negotiating with me. And that makes it harder for divided government to come together. But I am willing to work through all those issues. The only thing that our democracy can't afford is a situation where one side says, unless I get my way and only my way, unless I get concessions before we even start having a serious give and take, I'll threaten to shut down the government, or I will threaten to not pay America's bills. So, you know, I will not eliminate any topic of conversation. And I've shown myself willing to engage all the parties involved, every leader, on any issue.
And that applies no matter how long the time frame is on the clean bills that they would pass?
The only thing that I will say is that we're not going to pay a ransom for America paying its bills. That's something that should be non-negotiable, and everybody should agree on that. Everybody should say one of the most valuable things we have is America's creditworthiness. This is not something we should even come close to fooling around with. And so when I read people saying, oh, this wouldn't be a big deal, we should test it out. Let's take default out for a spin and see how it rides. And I say, imagine in your private life if you decided that I'm not going to pay my mortgage for a month or two. First of all, you're not saving money by not paying your mortgage. You're just a deadbeat. And you can anticipate that will hurt your credit, which means that in addition to debt collectors calling, you're going to have trouble borrowing in the future. And if you are able to borrow in the future, you're going to have to borrow at a higher rate. Well, what's true for individuals is also true for nations, even the most powerful nation on earth. And if we are creating an atmosphere in which people are not sure whether or not we pay our bills on time, then that will have a severe long-term impact on our economy and on America's standard of living. And that's not something that we should even be in a conversation about. That is not something that we should be using as leverage. Okay. Juliana Goldman.
Thank you, Mr. President. You laid out the economic consequences of default, but if we were to get to that point, would you prioritize and pay bondholders first to maintain a semblance of credit, or rather than Social Security recipients or military servicemen and women? And how would you go ahead and make that determination?
I'm going to continue to be very hopeful that Congress does not put us in that position. And I think if people understand what the consequences are, they will set that potential scenario aside. I do know that there have been some who've said that if we just pay bondholders, if we just pay people who've bought Treasury bills, that we really won't be in default because those interest payments will be made. And to them, what I have to remind them is we've got a lot of other obligations, not just people who pay Treasury bills. We got senior citizens who are counting on their Social Security check arriving on time. We have veterans who are disabled who are counting on their benefits. We have companies who are doing business for our government and for our military that have payrolls that they have to meet. And if they do not get paid on time, they may have to lay off workers. All those folks are potentially affected if we are not able to pay all of our bills on time. What's also true is if the markets are saying that we're not paying all our bills on time, that will affect our credit worthiness even if some people are being paid on time. So again, just to boil this down to personal examples. If you've got a mortgage, a car note, and a student loan that you have to pay, and you say, well, I'm going to make sure I pay my mortgage, but I'm not going to pay my student loan or my car note, that's still going to have an impact on your credit. Everybody's still going to look at that and say, you know what, I'm not sure this person's that trustworthy. And at minimum, presumably they're going to charge a higher interest rate. That's what would happen to you if you made those decisions. Well, the same is true for the federal government. So we are exploring all contingencies. I know that Secretary Lew, the Secretary of the Treasury, will be appearing before Congress on Thursday, and he can address some of the additional details about this. But let me be clear, no option is good in that scenario. There's no silver bullet. There's no magic wand that allows us to wish away the chaos that could result if, for the first time in our history, we don't pay our bills on time. And when I hear people trying to downplay the consequences of that, I think that's really irresponsible. And I'm happy to talk to any of them individually and walk them through exactly why it's irresponsible. And it's particularly funny coming from Republicans who claim to be champions of business. There's no business person out here who thinks this wouldn't be a big deal. Not one. You go to anywhere from Wall Street to Main Street and you ask a CEO of a company, or ask a small business person whether it'd be a big deal if the United States government isn't paying its bills on time. They'll tell you it's a big deal. It would hurt. And it's unnecessary. That's the worst part of it. This is not a complicated piece of business. And there's no reason why, if in fact Republicans are serious about wanting to negotiate, wanting to have a conversation, wanting to talk, there's no reason why you have to have that threat looming over the conversations. I mean, think about it. The only reason that the Republicans have held out on negotiations up until the last week or so is because they thought it was a big enough deal that they would force unilateral concessions out of Democrats and out of me. They said so. They basically said, you know what, the president's so responsible that if we just hold our breath and say we're going to threaten default, then he'll give us what we want and we won't have to give anything in return. That's not my account of the situation. You can read statements from Republicans over the last several months who said this explicitly. And so for them now to say, well, it wouldn't be a big deal if it happens, that's not how they've been acting over the last couple of months. And if it's not a big deal, then why would I give them concessions now to avoid it? It is a big deal. And nobody should be getting concessions for making sure that the full faith and credit of the United States is retained. Sam Stein.
Thank you, Mr. President. With Speaker Boehner so far unwilling to hold the vote on the clean CR, what assurances can you give to those affected by a shutdown who are concerned about an even longer impasse? And how worried are you personally that your preferred solution to this clean CR at sequestration levels may do harm to the nation's economy and your second-term agenda?
Well, I mean, Sam, you're making an important point, which is what we're asking of the Republicans right now is to keep the government open at funding levels that Democrats think are very harmful to the economy and inadequate to make sure that the economy is growing faster, more people are put back to work, and the middle class is growing. We're willing to pass at least a short-term budget that opens up the government at current funding levels. It doesn't even address the harm that's been done because of sequestration. Now, the Democrats have a budget that would eliminate sequestration, this meat cleaver approach to deficit reduction, and make sure that we're adequately funding basic medical research and Head Start programs and VA programs and a whole range of things that have been really hard hit this year. But we recognize that there are going to have to be some compromises between the Democratic position and the Republican position. And in the meantime, we shouldn't hurt the economy even worse by shutting down the government. So let me just give you an example, very specific. Because of sequestration, because of the meat cleaver cuts that have been taking place over the course of this year, thousands of families have lost Head Start slots for their children. Right, so you've had parents all across the country who've been scrambling trying to figure out, how can I find some decent quality child care for my kids? Now, the government shutdown means several thousand more are going to be losing their slots. If we vote today or tomorrow or the next day in the House of Representatives to go ahead and reopen the government, at least those additional several thousand people will be spared the difficulties of trying to scramble and figure out where your kid's going to be when you're trying to go to work. But it doesn't solve the broader problems, and if we were going to have real negotiations, Democrats would say, let's solve the bigger problem. What about all those thousands who've been hurt by sequester? But Democrats aren't making that demand right now. We understand there's going to have to be some give and take. What we are saying is, don't hurt more people while we're trying to resolve these differences. Let's just at least make sure that we keep the lights on while we're having these conversations.
You support back pay for furlough workers?
Excuse me?
You support back pay for furlough workers?
Absolutely. I mean, that's how we've always done. Roberta Rampton.
You talked a bit about the hit to credibility around the world that this impasse has caused. I'm wondering what you and your administration are telling worried foreign creditors, China and Japan, who are calling and asking about whether the United States is going to avoid defaulting on its debt.
Well, I won't disclose any specific conversations, but obviously my message to the world is the United States always has paid its bills, and it will do so again. But I think they're not just looking at what I say, they're looking at what Congress does. And that ultimately is up to Speaker Boehner. This will not get resolved. We're not going to calm creditors until they see Speaker Boehner call up a bill that reopens the government and authorizes the Secretary of the Treasury to pay our bills on time. And until they see that, there's going to be a cloud over U.S. economic credibility. But it is not one from which we can't recover. I mean, we've been through this before. Every country, every democracy in particular, has tussles over the budget, and I think most world leaders understand it. They've themselves been through it if they're in a democracy. What you haven't seen before, I think from the vantage point of a lot of world leaders, is the notion that one party in Congress might blow the whole thing up if they don't get their way. They've never seen that before. And that does make them nervous, particularly given what happened in 2011. I mean, keep in mind, we've been here before, right? We saw what happened in 2011. I think the assumption was that the Americans must have learned their lesson, that there would be budget conflicts, but nobody, again, would threaten the possibility that we would default. And when they hear members of the Senate and members of Congress saying maybe default wouldn't be that bad, I'll bet that makes them nervous. Makes me nervous. It should make the American people nervous, because that's